Make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and share it with friends and fellow story lovers. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on your screen to stay updated with more real and captivating stories from Inquisco. Also, let us know in the comments what kind of stories you'd like to see next. We'll pick the best one and create a video. The weekend started just like any other. My son Caleb had invited his best friend Jamal to stay over for a few days. It wasn't unusual. Jamal had spent countless weekends at our house over the years. The boys had been inseparable since middle school, and I had always considered Jamal part of the family. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when they arrived. Even before the door opened, I could hear their laughter. Caleb's deep chuckle blending with Jamal's lighter, carefree laugh. "Hey, Mom," Caleb greeted me, dropping his duffel bag near the entrance. "Hi, Mrs. Dawson," Jamal added warmly, his voice familiar. "Hey, boys," I responded with a smile. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour. Go ahead and put your stuff away." Jamal gave me a polite nod before following Caleb upstairs. As they disappeared, I found myself reflecting on how much Jamal had grown over the years. He was no longer the lanky kid who raided our fridge and stayed up all night playing video games. He had grown taller, with broad shoulders and a self-assured way of carrying himself. Shaking off the thought, I returned my focus to chopping vegetables. By the time they came back downstairs, dinner was ready. We sat together, chatting and laughing about everything from Caleb's latest soccer game to Jamal's plans for college. After eating, the boys headed to the basement where Caleb's gaming setup was. I cleaned the kitchen, enjoying the faint sound of their conversation drifting up the stairs. It was comforting, the normalcy of it all. The next morning, Caleb left early for soccer practice, leaving Jamal and me alone in the house. He wandered downstairs as I was making coffee, his hair slightly messy, his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Good morning," I replied, handing him a mug. "Thanks," he said, taking a sip and leaning against the counter. We talked for a while, the conversation easy and natural. He shared updates on his classes, his goal of studying engineering, and the part-time job he had picked up at a hardware store. I listened, surprised by how much he had matured. As the day went on, I started noticing small things. His warm smile, his thoughtful manners, the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. I told myself they were just observations, nothing more, yet there was a warmth in his presence that was hard to ignore. When Caleb returned that afternoon, the atmosphere shifted back to normal. We spent the evening playing board games and watching movies, the house filled with laughter and the scent of popcorn. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of the way Jamal had looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was subtle, a flicker of something in his eyes that I couldn't quite name. I brushed it off as overthinking. He was just a kid, my son's friend. Nothing more. Yet, as I drifted to sleep, the memory of his gaze lingered at the back of my mind. The next day was a slow Saturday, much like any other. Caleb had another early soccer practice, leaving me and Jamal alone once again. I had planned to do some cleaning, but when I came downstairs, I found Jamal already tidying up the living room, vacuuming and straightening things up. "Morning," I said, surprised. "Morning, Mrs. Dawson," he replied, turning off the vacuum. "I thought I'd help out a bit. Caleb mentioned you've had a lot on your plate lately." I smiled, touched by the gesture. "That's really kind of you, Jamal. Thank you." He shrugged, his easy grin lighting up his face. "It's the least I can do. You've always been so good to me." As he continued cleaning, I busied myself with laundry but couldn't help noticing how thorough he was. Dusting the shelves, fluffing the pillows, even wiping down the coffee table. By the time he finished, the living room looked better than it had in weeks. "You really didn't have to do all that," I said as he joined me in the kitchen. "I wanted to," he replied, leaning casually against the counter. "You deserve a break." Something in the way he said it, gentle, almost reverent, made my heart skip a beat. I quickly turned my attention to folding a towel. "You hungry?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah," he nodded, pulling up a stool at the counter. As I cooked, we talked about his future, his favorite movies, his childhood memories of spending time at our house. "You always made me feel welcome," he said softly. "I don't think I ever thanked you for that." I glanced at him, momentarily caught off guard by the sincerity in his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Jamal. You're family." He held my gaze a moment longer than felt appropriate before I quickly looked away, focusing on flipping pancakes. After breakfast, I suggested we spend time outside. It was a beautiful day, too nice to stay indoors. We ended up in the backyard, sunlight filtering through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the lawn. Jamal offered to help with some gardening, and I gladly accepted. We worked side by side, pulling weeds and planting flowers. At one point, I stood to stretch and caught him watching me, his expression unreadable. "What?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Nothing," he said quickly, a faint flush rising to his cheeks. You just, you look happy out here." His words took me by surprise, and for a second, I didn't know how to respond. There was something in his tone, a quiet intensity that made my stomach flutter. I forced a smile, brushing dirt off my hands. "Well, it's hard not to be happy on a day like this." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a moment longer before he turned back to the flower bed. As the afternoon stretched on, the unspoken tension between us grew more noticeable. It was in the way he stood a little too close, how his laughter seemed softer, more personal when we shared a joke. At one point, I tripped over a loose stone and Jamal caught me before I could fall. His hands were firm on my arms, steadying me. For a moment, we just stood there, too close, the air charged with something unspoken. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I said quickly, stepping back. "Thanks." The rest of the day blurred by. Caleb returned later that afternoon, his energy filling the house, breaking whatever spell had lingered. But as we sat down to dinner, I couldn't shake the memory of Jamal's hands on my arms. The way his touch had lingered just a second too long. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of what had happened, or almost happened, pressed heavily on my mind. As the reality of what had nearly transpired sank in, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a fleeting misunderstanding. Yet, deep inside, I couldn't ignore the undeniable connection between us. A connection that felt both dangerous and impossible to dismiss. No matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the thought lingered. What if Caleb hadn't come home when he did? The next morning, I woke up determined to put the previous day's unsettling emotions behind me. Jamal was just a boy I had known for years, nothing more. I resolved to keep my distance and let the weekend pass without giving those brief moments more weight than they deserved. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. With Caleb away for a tournament and my husband unexpectedly called into work, Jamal and I were left alone in the house once again. I had planned to spend the day running errands, but an unexpected storm darkened the sky, trapping us indoors. "Looks like we're stuck here," Jamal said, gazing out the living room window as the rain streaked down the glass. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "Good day to just relax, I guess." I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to ignore my growing awareness of his presence. The house felt smaller than usual, and the silence between us seemed to carry an unspoken weight. By early afternoon, the rain had softened into a light drizzle, and I decided to finally tackle a long overdue project, cleaning out the attic. When Jamal offered to help, I hesitated but eventually agreed. The attic was cramped and dusty, filled with old boxes containing remnants of the past, photographs, souvenirs, forgotten keepsakes. At first, we worked quietly, sorting through the clutter. "Is this you?" Jamal asked, holding up a faded photograph of me from my college years. I glanced at it and chuckled. "Yeah, that was a long time ago." "You look beautiful," he said, his voice gentle. I looked up, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. His eyes held mine, steady and filled with something I couldn't quite name. For a moment, I was unable to look away. "Thank you," I murmured, barely above a whisper. We continued working, but the atmosphere had changed. Every accidental brush of his arm against mine, every lingering glance sent a charge through the air. At one point, we both reached for the same box, and our hands touched. I instinctively began to pull away, but he didn't let go. "Mrs. Dawson," he said softly, almost as if pleading. "Jamal, don't," I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped closer, his hand still holding mine. His dark eyes searched mine, filled with hesitation and longing. "I know this is wrong," he whispered, barely audible, "but I can't stop thinking about you." My heart pounded. My thoughts raced with confusion and guilt. I wanted to step away, to put an end to whatever was happening, but his words, his gaze, kept me frozen in place. "Jamal, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't right." "I know," he said, his hand dropping to his side. "I'm sorry, I needed you to know." The moment between us stretched, heavy with everything left unsaid. Then, as if recognizing an invisible boundary, he took a step back. I should go, he said, his voice tight. I nodded, unable to find the right words. He turned and left the attic, leaving me standing there with my hands shaking and my heart pounding. When I finally made my way downstairs, the house was eerily quiet. Jamal was gone, taking with him the tension that had been building all weekend. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of what had nearly happened pressed down on me. I knew I had to set clear boundaries to ensure that nothing like this ever occurred again. And yet, even as I resolved to move forward, I couldn't shake the memory of his words, the way he had looked at me, as if I were the only person in the world. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen.